Another day, another story. Yes, many plants use the birds and the bees to move pollen from one flower to another, but sometimes this simple act is not so simple. Some plants have stepped up their sexual game and use explosions, entrapment, or deception to ensure the perpetuation of their species. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. 1. Sexual deception. Bee orchids, genus Ophrys, are an absolutely stunning example of reproductive evolution. Sometimes referred to as prostitute orchids, the plant's flowers mimic the appearance, scent, and often even the fuzzy texture of a female bee. Lured by pheromone-like chemicals, unwitting male bees engage in pseudocopulation with the seductive flowers. While the bee is otherwise engaged, the flower releases sticky packets of pollen, known as pollinia, on the insect's head or body. When the bee falls for the trick again with another flower, he deposits the pollinia and thus pollinates the new flower. Unlike the more traditional forms of flower-bee interactions where the insect receives nectar for its efforts, the deceived bees get nothing in return from these orchids and actually expend a lot of energy in their futile mating. 2. Catch and release. Cucupint plants, Arum maculatum, also victimize their insect pollinators, but mostly by wasting their time. The tiny flowers are borne in a column, called a spadix, with the female flowers at the bottom and the male flowers above them. The spadix is surrounded by a single petal-like appendage known as a spathe, which has hair-like structures on the inside, above the male flowers. Not only does this unusual flower structure emit a foul, fecal smell, but it also generates heat to attract a number of poo-loving insects. As they climb around on the slick spathe, they slide down into its interior and are kept from escaping by the hairs on the inside. Eventually the hairs relax and the insects are able to escape past the male flowers, which cover them in pollen. 3. Stinking corpses. While most people think of pollinators as only bees and butterflies, beetles and flies can also do a good job if properly motivated. Enter the corpse flower. Corpse flowers, including the massive Rafflesia and Amorphophallus titanum, and several other species, are able to produce rancid, malodorous fumes to attract carrion-loving insects. Several such flowers even complete the effect with mottled red and brown petals and oozing structures to look like rotting flesh. Seeking a tasty meal, scavenging beetles and flies investigate the flowers and inadvertently transfer pollen from one stinking flower to the next. 4. It's a breeze. While many plants rely on pollinators, quite a few trees and most grasses save on the cost of nectar and showy petals by simply using the wind to spread their pollen. The flowers of these plants are usually extremely reduced, consisting of the bare necessities required for sperms to meet egg. Fun fact, most plants require 2 sperms for fertilization. Since wind is really unpredictable, wind-pollinated plants typically make a ton of pollen to compensate, and many of them are responsible for your seasonal allergies. Some plants even make their flowers before other species have begun to leaf out in early spring to reduce the physical barriers the pollen might encounter on its breezy trip through the forest. 5. What's the buzz? Sonication, or buzz pollination, is a quirky pollination strategy employed by a number of bee-pollinated plants, including tomatoes and shooting stars. The flowers of these plants have specialized anthers, the pollen-producing structures, that only release their pollen if properly vibrated by a buzzing bee. Some even require a certain buzz frequency and thus limit their pollen to specific sizes of bees. Interestingly, honeybees cannot buzz pollinate, and so the act is limited to certain solitary bees and bumblebees. Plants that require sonication are usually self-fertile, and the adaptation serves to limit the amount of self-pollen, and thus inbreeding, the flower might receive if wind or other motions could dislodge the pollen. By allowing only certain pollinators access to the precious pollen, these plants increase the chances that a suitable insect will carry their pollen out to other flowers and increase the population's genetic diversity through outcrossing. 6. By the pale moonlight. There are 4 species of yucca moths, each of which is the unique pollinator of a species of yucca. These plants and insects are one of the most intimate and famous examples of coevolution and mutualism. Their life cycles are fully dependent on one another. The moths emerge from the soil when the night-blooming yucca flowers open. The insects mate, and then the female moth forms a ball of pollen from one flower and inserts it into the stigma of a second flower. With this act of pollination complete, she then lays her eggs in the ovary of that flower, ensuring that her progeny will develop inside the fruit she facilitated. The adult moths quickly die after mating. The moth larvae grow inside the fruit and eat about half of the seeds within it. When the fruits fall to the ground, the larvae finish their development in the soil. 7. Pollinators are friends, not food. Insect-pollinated carnivorous plants have the special challenge of not consuming their helpful pollinators. To avoid such accidental ingestion, many carnivorous species, such as the Venus flytrap, bear their flowers on long stalks to keep them as far away from their traps as possible. Similarly, some pitcher plants have their pitcher traps near the ground to attract crawling insects and leave the airways free for flying insects seeking their flowers. Other carnivorous plants use scents or patterns in an attempt to direct specific types of prey to their traps and to guide pollinators safely to their flowers. Finally, some species avoid the problem altogether by self-pollinating or spreading vegetatively. 8. Poof. Hummingbirds are the most well-known avian pollinators, but they are not the only ones. Certain tropical tanagers facilitate the pollination of plants in the genus Axinea through an unusual mechanism known as puff pollination. The unique flowers of these plants have special juicy organs attached to their stamens, male parts, that look like fruit to the birds. When a bird grasps the food body to eat it, it receives a blast of pollen in its face. Fascinatingly, this puff pollination is completely dependent on the power of the bird's beak, as the fruit-like structure and the anther form something like a turkey baster, or bellow. It is thought that the birds complete the pollination cycle when they visit other flowers, but it is possible that the mechanism simply serves as a means to get the pollen airborne for wind pollination. 9. No help necessary. Some plants are self-compatible, meaning that their own pollen can successfully pollinate flowers on the same plant. To reduce inbreeding, many self-compatible plants use this ability only as a last resort and often employ a number of strategies to give priority to pollen from other plants. However, some self-compatible plants have evolved to specifically pollinate their own flowers. This allows the plants to thrive in areas with limited pollinators, such as at very high elevations, and perpetuates traits that are well adapted to the habitat requirements. The self-pollination is also useful in plant populations with few flowers or with plants that are spaced far apart. Obligatory self-pollinating plants have a diverse array of strategies to facilitate the union of the pollen with the female stigma. Some employ oils to slide the pollen from the anther to the awaiting stigma, or they liquefy the pollen to the same end. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.